we will record, very well, right on cue. We'll record this part, but we'll turn it off for the questions so that people feel able to ask questions freely under Chatham House rules. So just to recap again, I think most of you have been in our previous seminars, but the way that we view all of our research and work is through the British 7 segments, which is our values-based segmentation, which we developed in Britain's Choice and also collaborated with Climate Outreach on as part of Britain Talks Climate. And these are the 7 segments. I won't run through them all now because we have done in previous presentations. And again, one of the angles, one of the ways to view the segments is, there's the values and starting points, but also the fact that, as you would expect, they have different voting preferences, but also the changing directions of those voting preferences is quite important as well, and gives you a sense of how British politics is realigning and the particularly important groups in British politics at the moment. As with previous seminars, we said, those 2 groups, the established Liberals and loyal Nationals, currently make up the most kind of volatile part of the electorate at the moment. One representing perhaps the Conservatives' more traditional base, among kind of, I guess you'd call them sort of liberal-minded Conservatives, Cameron Conservatives, where they're trying to shore up their support, and loyal Nationals, that group who perhaps best reflect what's become known as the Red Wall voter, and who the Conservatives won for the first time in the last election and want to keep. So, as we think about our campaigning efforts in the run-up to the next election, obviously the whole of society is important, but those 2 groups in particular will be kind of front of centre, at least in terms of strategy, formulation process, and the media coverage as well. Go on to the next slide. So again, not to rehash what we talked about in the previous seminars, but I think one of the keys for thinking about how we talk about the benefits of net zero or the benefits of transition is how we deal with the fact that we likely have a very tough winter ahead of us. And what is striking is that even from our more affluent segments in more affluent areas of the country, there are real worries about what the winter holds. People don't think there's been lots of I think positive chatter this week about inflation expectations becoming re-anchored, but for the public at least, they predict a very difficult winter ahead. And I just thought it was useful playing this very brief clip for you, just so you can get a feeling of what that sounds like. And again, bear in mind, this was Guildford, it was backbone Conservatives, established Liberals, so certainly not a sort of heat or read group, but even so, it's interesting to see how they talk about it. Conleth,
are we at the worst of it now, do you think? Or do you think it's going to get worse? Is it going to get better? How optimistic are people?
Worse, I think.
I think it's going to get worse. Yeah.
Pretty cynical. It's going to get terrible. Way worse.
Like we said, we've got the winter to come.
Mm-hmm.
And they think that gas and electric is going to go. I think in October, it's all going to go up again. The cost of fuel, petrol's still going up, even though they claim it's supposed to be going down. It hasn't. I mean, it's nearly £2 a litre now. It was 99p in lockdown.
Yeah. We are all getting some money, aren't we? I think. Is it everyone's getting some money?
It won't last long. They won't cover much, will it?
Is it £100 or something?
600, I think, isn't it, or 400?
400.
Oh, 4.
But
that might pay 1 month's bill in this house then.
So you see, that it just gives you a snapshot into how people are feeling about what lies ahead, and the fact that, I thought Alison's quote was quite telling, that even, despite the support package, even in these quite affluent or relatively affluent households, their feeling is it actually won't touch the sides. So again, worth bearing that in mind. So how can we sort of change the narrative and talk about net zero in a way which resonates, which doesn't look, I guess, indulgent in light of the fact that there's war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis, people are struggling, COVID most likely will be going through another peak. in winter as well. And the first thing that we found very clearly, both from our focus group discussions and from polling, is that it is better not to talk about net zero, but instead, that doesn't mean don't be transparent. It means that talk about what net zero actually does rather than using that phrase. I thought it was really interesting that when we tested, we found that in every single segment, from the progressives to the backbone conservatives, using language around reducing greenhouse gases so that the amount we produce is the same as the amount we remove, resonated much more strongly, or attracted much more support than using that phrase net zero. So there's something clearly there about sort of explaining to the public that idea of, this isn't about, I think the use of the phrase zero in particular, we found in focus groups, and we'll go on to talk about how people interpret it in a second, but that zero phrase worries people, whereas the idea of what we put out, what we put in, people like that idea. In fact, we find across, this isn't just climate, but it's across a whole series of topics we work in, particularly in Britain, and it's quite unique to Britain as opposed to some of the other countries we work in. This idea of striving for balance really appeals to people. So we think that's one opportunity there, and it doesn't involve any policy changes or changing level of ambition. It's about as close to a sort of strategic comms slam dunk as you can get, I think. So that was, we thought that was interesting. And why, let's go to the next slide. Why is it that net zero doesn't work as well? Well, the first thing is that, it's actually, we did some testing of, what do people think that the word meant? And only just over a third could identify that net zero is about removing as many emissions as we produce. Significant numbers thinking meant that we should have none. Some thought it was about, removing all we'd ever produce. Some thought it was about air pollution. Interestingly, you get those sort of tiny segments, but still significant if you think about the numbers of people involved who think it's about immigration or raw material extraction from the earth. So clearly, and you can sort of, I guess, one approach is you can think, well, actually, should we spend our time trying to educate the public? I actually don't think this is one of those cases where that is the right approach, because the wording itself doesn't matter so much, because people are more bought in to the idea of tackling climate change when net zero isn't used. And I think the other thing is, what's interesting is that the groups who do understand what net zero meant more, so it tended to be progressive activists and established liberals, the more engaged, more liberal, generally more likely to prioritise climate change, were more likely to know what it meant than perhaps some of the more disengaged groups as well. So we don't think it's something that we need to worry about, the net zero language. And in fact, actually, we think there are sort of opportunities from it as well. Firstly, I think there's some benefit in the idea that it, it can mean slightly different things to different people, and identifying those starting points and what people want it to mean can help to safeguard consensus. But I also think, and we were going to do a bit more work on this going forward, I think it's important to remind people as well that there isn't just one way to achieve transition. We talked a bit in the last seminar about the idea that, one of the sort of potent anti-net zero arguments might be that we should have a referendum, people should have a say. Well, actually, people can have a say for elections, but also people can have a say in terms of how we transition, how we reach net zero. And that doesn't mean we have to drag everyone along to a citizens' assembly, though some will want to take part in that. It's more that there are different choices, and policymakers and others and people they vote for can opt for those different choices depending on what the public want. I think that's really quite important for restoring agency. Slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I sort of put at the end of this presentation, actually, it means that, Extinction Rebellion, who probably have the most high-profile vision of what reaching net zero should look like, actually you're able to say, look, that isn't the only way. It doesn't necessarily involve, in fact, almost certainly won't involve the abolition of capitalism, even though some people will see that as a kind of worthy aim. So we think that's quite important to bear in mind going forward. Go to the next slide. The other thing to remember is that tangibility really matters to people and affects not just what they interpret as climate change, but also, how likely they are to be supporting tackling it. And it was really interesting. The biggest difference by far that we see, across our segments, is what the biggest issues within climate change are for people. I'm interested that for the progressive activist group, it is, it's what it says on the tin. It's the rising global temperatures is the big issue, the big area of concern. Whereas as you move across those segments, the two disengaged groups, for them, most clearly, it's, climate change is going to lead to increase, even further increases in what I'm paying. And then for the more right-leaning groups, it's something, it comes back to that idea of plastic in the ocean. And plastic in the ocean has cut through to people. And again, I think there's a school of thought which says, God, we need to convince people that climate change isn't about plastic in the ocean and actually get them to understand. There's actually another school of thought which is, look, clearly this is the issue of biggest concern to people, and that actually things, living more sustainable lifestyles, making the changes we need to make to tackle net zero go hand in hand with how we tackle plastic in the ocean. So actually working with the grain of what people understand to be the biggest issues, I think is really important. And again, the other thing I would just stress is just how much of, actually, if you look at 6 of the segments, even though they have sort of different orders, the 3 things that they put in are almost broadly the same, things dropping in out. Whereas progressive activists, they're almost entirely different to what the other groups are saying, and certainly the levels between them there, particularly on things like the sea levels, temperatures. So again, many of us working in this sector will be in the progressive activist segment, and I think, and many of the people you work with and people will be most engaged will see the priorities slightly differently. So when we're talking about net zero, we need to be able to reflect actually what do others see as the benefits for getting there. Carry on to the next. So what are some of the top level framings building on that? What have we sort of tested that works? So the first thing is there is certainly no harm in highlighting, and we find in focus groups in highlighting sort of catastrophic weather events. I guess what I would say is those issues tend to cut through much more without us pushing them, that people see them on the news, and that actually there's a bit of a danger in repeating them, that people never get to see the other side of the argument, that what are we striving for? Is this all purely mitigation? And it was really interesting. We found that sort of positive vision message, which isn't, and I think it's really important to say, this isn't like we're going to have some green utopia. It's, Britain's future with cleaner air, where things are cheaper, where people live longer, healthier, happier lives. I mean, actually, given where the country feels like it is at the moment, it might be a utopia. But it's that very kind of practical, optimistic vision, but which doesn't sound like it's in cloud cuckoo land. Getting over 70% support for that message is a reason to reach net zero. Interestingly, we tested this with Prince Charles saying it with half of the sample, and it actually slightly lowered support, although it was still there. So I think, there's obviously been a lot of debate about, the role of the royals in the net zero debate. And I think it's, don't assume it's an unalloyed good, that sometimes actually the messages stand better on their own. If you flick across, government is here to listen. I think that recognition of anxieties is quite important for a lot of people. It can't be a sense of, your concerns are irrelevant, we've got to do this, it's our way or the highway. I think acknowledgement really matters. Again, it was 39% positive net response. Once you added the Boris Johnson's name to it, that dropped again significantly. It's still positive, but I think there is, I don't actually think that's just a Boris fact. It's a reflection of the fact that politicians themselves are not seen as trusted messengers in this space. So even though it still ends up net positive, the fact that it comes down so much with that second half of the sample, I think is really important. Flip it the other way around, when you get onto the practical messages, and this is, I guess, is the sense that we're calling for evolution, not revolution here. Just like we turn the tide on recycling, when you get to your next car, do this. When your boiler breaks, do this, rather than, let's rip your house down for the sake of it now. Attracts positive support. You add the name of a trusted messenger in that kind of financial space, with someone who's very congruent with that message, like Martin Lewis, and that jumps up to 52% net positive. And then, I think this was probably the most interesting insight from this message testing that we did. This idea of no choice, us amplifying that extreme weather event argument ourselves. Again, still more people supported it, said it was a reason for doing transition than disagreed, but only plus 4% positive support. We added Greta as the messenger on it, and it went up very slightly to plus 6. But what was interesting was that was almost entirely driven by an increase in support from progressive activists who, as we've said, tend to be more sold on taking climate action already. What's the next? And then, so moving away from those top lines, it's how do we talk about the benefits which are actually, as I say, sort of recognize where Britons are at. They're kind of, we've called it kind of hopes and fears, but, you might equally say, desires and anxieties as well. How do you talk and frame the benefits in a way which is congruent with them? Go to the next slide. I think one thing to play into, and one thing that we try to dig into, is actually what does make people excited. Like, what do people think that the future looks like? Because actually, if we can tailor message about transitioning in a way which leads us along that path of things that things are looking forward, people are looking forward to, actually it will lead to increased support for the mission. And what was really interesting was, firstly, that it's very clear that for lots of people, it's medical advancements are what they're most excited about. 65% said that they sort of found it exciting, this idea that we might have cures for diseases. But what's also interesting is the extent to which actually there is a little bit of sort of techno-optimism about the future, that actually we are going to keep on kind of inventing things which make life better, which, help things, help us move forward, which make things easier. That actually, and I think it's just a caution against some of that messaging, which can be, I think, a little bit kind of atavistic, that, all of climate change is about turning back the clock. I don't know if any of you saw Lars Frost's piece earlier today, which was arguing that, climate change was going to turn back the clock to or tackling climate change was going to mean going back to before the Industrial Revolution. Actually, I did a thread on this earlier, I think it's them that are making the kind of what you might call more Luddite argument, that we turn back to the sort of 1960s and don't ever accept that we can make technological progress going forward. So I think there is definitely something about leaning into that sense of excitement. And if we go on to the next slide, we sort of dug into what makes people scared. Interesting to hear much more of a split in terms of what people are worried about. And I think there is a way of thinking about some of these sort of fears that people have and how they relate to climate. And I don't think, I actually think that as I said, I think with the things like catastrophic weather events, it should be a bit more, show rather than tell. But it's interesting to see how some of these might relate. And actually, as things like climate competition for resources becomes more embedded in the popular consciousness, and people are more worried about future wars, the link between climate and pandemics, I think that will happen quite naturally, that people will start to make the links. I think there's probably more of a risk at this stage of us trying to do the linking for people. And then finally, for me, and then I will hand over to Conleth, I think there is just something it's worth bearing in mind, that actually most people, they just don't expect things to change that much. And I think this is a good thing. This is a really good thing, because, we are a naturally quite small c conservative country that, the sort of this idea of us having a radical change, new future, actually for lots of people isn't what they want. And again, we should lean into that. And I just thought it was so surprising, again, when we asked, do you think UK policies tackle climate change have a positive or negative impact on their lives? I'd sort of expected it to be many more people on either side saying positive or negative, whereas actually across almost all of them, don't know, so in the majority. The two which stand out to me as exceptions are firstly your children's future. And again, this won't surprise those of you who've worked in public opinion in this space for a while, but you do often get, particularly like children and grandchildren, people talk about, well, we kind of got to do it for them. And I do think that's one of the areas where leaning into the more sunlit upland message is important. But it's not just about, say, it's so that, young people can have the same opportunities that I've had today, I've had in my life, because we're going to tackle this and stop this. And then, of course, the one kind of, I guess, worry spot on the agenda, sort of flashing up, is the savings one. I think is just one to keep an eye on, because it was by far the one where people were most worried that actually policies to tackle climate change would have a negative impact on their lives. And this, and sorry, I should also say this is, I'm going to put that progressive activists, again, outliers on some, but not all. So interestingly, on personal health, progressive activists much more likely to think that UK policies to tackle climate change would have a positive impact. The other sectors are slightly more skeptical, but when it comes to some of the other policies, it's a bit more space. I think worth bringing out, and part of this is driven by the fact that disengaged segments are more likely to say don't know to things because they're not as engaged on issues. But I think it was worth pointing out that the disengaged battlers and disengaged traditionalists, so disengaged voters on both the right and left of the political spectrum, being less likely to agree with that kind of positive image, that positive impact for their children's future or positive for their local community. And it suggests we've probably still got a bit of work with kind of the more disengaged to convince them of some of the benefits that might be around the corner. Go on to this one. And finally, and then I will hand over, I just wanted to show you this clip because I think it shows you, I've spoken to a few of you about it before, but I think it just shows you how a very small kind of practical example of where people who want to do the right thing on climate, want to do their bit for the environment, but see in a very small way, oh gosh, it makes, it does make my life just a little bit worse as a result. And I think thinking about that messaging and how you counter that is really important. It's a very small example, but it's the fact that these small things where people think, oh God, this move to do environmental stuff, just making things less good, will build up over time. So we'll just play this and then I'll hand over to Conleth.
Let's get to the main topic here. The straws now. McDonald's straws. I can't enjoy my milkshake since they've changed from plastic to the alternative. And I know it's better for the economy, but if it's not better for us now in this time, then what's the point?
What's that about straws, Sophie? I missed that, darling. Sorry.
They're horrible now. They're terrible, Denise. The ones at McDonald's are awful compared to the plastic.
Go to Subway, pinch some out of Subway. You keep them in your car for when you go to McDonald's. That's what we do.
We shouldn't have to do it. They want us to make the world a better place, but it's getting worse for us, isn't it?
Great. So for McDonald's straws, we can stay in Blackpool, which has provided a lot of inspiration for this point. We've done a series of focus groups across the country as part of our work over the last 9 months or so, and it's been really clear that whenever the benefits, the kind of strongest argument that you can make about the benefits of net zero are the local ones. So what is the difference that it can make to Blackpool? What is the difference that it can make to Blyth? And particularly in the kind of context of the levelling up agenda, places which traditionally powered the country in the past or who had a strong sense of industry, there's definitely an opportunity for the place to kind of get that sense of purpose back again. We saw, look, already talked about how people don't expect it to be much of much benefit for them personally in terms of their job prospects, but in terms of the broader opportunity for the places, there's definitely an opportunity there. Now, in this webinar today, we've been trying to focus a bit more on the time ahead, and our prediction is that that the need to talk about the local benefits of net zero will increase further as the winter months come and the cost of living crisis worsens. So we recently asked in a poll whether people agreed or disagreed with this idea that charity begins at home. And you can see that in every segment, there's majority agreement. And in two of the segments, there's a majority of strongly agree to this idea. And on the right-leaning segments, so the Loyal Nationals, the Disengaged Traditionalists, and the Backbone Conservatives, those are very, very high levels of agreement to this idea that charity begins at home. And we that checks out with what we hear in the focus groups. And so thinking about talking about the national and the local benefits of tackling climate change is where the conversation needs to focus on. Obviously, many progressives are rightly animated and motivated by the global injustice of climate change, and there is a lot of activism that's going in there. But when it comes to securing the UK, the British consensus for net zero, the focus has to be on the local and the national environment if it wants to resonate with the public. And there's an interesting kind of dimension to this. So we asked, what do people mean, or what do they think about whenever they said charity begins at home? And for many people, it's about helping people in Britain first before helping other countries. So there's that kind of development aid lens that many of you might be familiar with. But there's also this idea that it's about helping your family first and being responsible for your family, and that kind of idea of responsibility comes in very strongly. And there was an interesting dynamic in the data where older groups and more conservative leaning segments, they saw this kind of charity beginning at home on that more development aid lens, whereas younger groups saw it more in that home lens. But there's a way of talking about behaviour change and responsibility for your family that can help to localise what we're the framing and narrative that we have around climate transition as well. The second area that we think is important here, and it's come really strongly in the focus groups in the last few months, is not overselling the benefits. So Luke talked about the sunlit uplands and just having that kind of cheaper bills, cleaner air, better future, but not like this green utopia that it just lands flat. And the other thing is about not trying to promise too much action from the government, because there is a very low trust in the government. That there's a strong belief that the system is rigged. And many people will say, we've been promised this time and time again. So if you are going to promise me better public transport, I've been promised that for the last 30 years. If you're going to promise me, that the potholes are going to get filled in, I'd love to see it. So there's a premium both on not overselling, but also on making sure that things that we do promise, or benefits that we do say we want to see, that they're delivered on, and that they're showing, not just telling, in a lot of this benefit work. The other thing is that we can kind of shift the narrative a little. It's kind of a nuance on these narratives. And so we tested the kind of anti-renewables message that, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. And there's worryingly high levels of agreement on that. And we think the kind of narrative implication of this is to shift the narrative away from the fact that renewables are perfectly reliable, because the public don't buy that, but that they're much more reliable than oil and gas. And the public are more worried about oil and gas being unreliable than renewables being unreliable. So there's an opportunity there to say that renewables are much more reliable. That's how to deal with this broader context of low trust, and that like dismissal of anything that's over promises and under delivers. That's those kind of nuanced narrative shifts are what we think we should be focusing on in the time ahead. The other thing is to really talk about the individual benefits of behaviour change. So we don't politicise behaviour change too much. We don't make it as part of this kind of radical transformative agenda. It's just like, this is good for you. Getting a heat pump is good. It reduces your bills. But it's also about, in the design of the policies and in the design of the campaigns for transition, we really focus on the practical questions and answering those practical questions. And whenever people have practical questions, we want them to see answers quickly. And we've done a lot of work in the last 6 months or so, looking at kind of 3 specific types of fairly major behaviour change. So in the cars we drive, in how we heat our homes, and in what we eat. And on driving in particular, we think that there's a space and to be kind of have real message discipline in the next 6 months at least, and even beyond that, about not expecting people to switch to an electric car in the middle of a cost of living crisis. But if they are changing their car, make the next one an electric car, because it's going to save you money. It's not about, you need to change now, the world is on fire and you need to invest this big amount of money on buying a much more expensive cars than the cars you bought in the past. It's about shifting that narrative to say, the next car that you buy, make it an electric car. And it's also about focusing on the first movers. In our segmentation, the groups who are going to be economically able to buy electric cars at the minute are progressive activists and established liberals. And you can do that through social grade analysis and many other things. But target those who can, rather than those who feel it's too much at the minute, because in this cost of living crisis, they really, even if before the crisis they thought it was going to be a few years, now it seems even further away. For many of them. We think that there's a narrative shift that can take place to focus really on the monthly savings rather than the upfront cost, so that the narrative becomes less about reinforcing the very expensive nature of electric cars or heat pumps, but more about the savings that you can get from month-to-month basis, and just focusing on the very practical benefits. Electric cars are quieter, they're less noisy, they're less fumes, they're nicer to drive, it's an enjoyable experience. On heating homes, or we did a lot of work on heat pumps. It's a similar, there are similar trends there, but focusing on very practical questions about, how much space is going to take up, focusing on getting plumbers and installers to recommend these things. Those are the people who are trusted on these issues, and being really focused on the fact that these things need to make warm houses. It can't be that we install hundreds of thousands of heat pumps and then we have hundreds of thousands of colder homes, and the public then feel that they've been ripped off once again for a very expensive piece of home heating technology that doesn't work as well as what they had in the past. And then on diet change, it's about focusing on not reducing it to zero. That again, the broader lesson about messaging around zero, the public think that's a bit extreme. The balancing messaging that we'll reduce a bit. In a focus group we did in Tiverton last week, people talked about having good meat once a week, so making that narrative that actually reducing can be enjoyable, and also focusing on having very tasty vegetarian food. That's how you will change behaviours eventually, by investing in people wanting to eat those foods. So the final thing that we'll talk about here is just on who's going to be talking about these benefits. And there's a group of people here who the public will listen to if they're talking about the benefits of net zero, from scientists to farmers. They think that these people should be talking about net zero, and they're more likely to listen to them talking about net zero more broadly. There's another group of people who they don't want to listen to, and that's your professional footballers, it's your influencers and celebrities, who they're like, well, what have they to tell me about climate transition? So it's really finding those very authentic messengers, farmers and the mechanics and the plumbers, people who might be affected. And particularly, we find that people who are at risk of losing their livelihood as a result of climate-related changes, they are the people who are one of the most trusted groups, and that aren't just a single individual like David Attenborough and Martin Lewis, who are very trusted, but there are people in communities all across the country who the public are much more likely to listen to. And so if they sell the benefits of net zero, the public are much more likely to listen to them. So that takes us to the end of the presentation, and I'll just stop recording.